So this afternoon we're going to look at the reasons for the purges. So there are 5 reasons that we're going to look at. Each of them can be traced back to a large extent to Stalin's character and personality, the fact that he didn't trust anybody and he saw enemies everywhere. So the first reason is he wanted to remove political opposition. So Kirov's murder has become a great whodunit, a great historical murder mystery. There is no evidence that has proven concretely that Stalin was involved in his murder, but if he wasn't involved in Kirov's murder, he certainly used it to his own advantage. So Kirov had opposed Stalin's demand that Ryutin, who was a critic of the 5-year plans, was to be executed. Kirov, as we've looked at, was also applauded at the 17th Party Congress. So he was a potential opponent for Stalin in the early 1930s. In fact, at that 17th Party Congress, Kirov received more votes than Stalin to be placed on the Central Committee. Some were rumoured to be encouraging him to challenge Stalin for leadership of the party, particularly as there was criticism at the time of the 5-year plans and of collectivisation. And what we know about the purges in Russia is that Stalin certainly used them to remove his political opponents. So all of those individuals that we looked at in the leadership contest, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, they were all eliminated in the purges. So the second reason for the purges was Stalin wanted total control. So again, this can be traced back to Stalin's character and traced back to Stalin's personality. So Stalin believed that there were groups who needed eliminating. One of these groups, which we looked at in collectivisation, was the kulaks. Stalin wanted dekulakization to take place, but what he found was when he issued orders which would implement the elimination of the kulaks, they were quite often ignored. So if he was feared, if he had total control, these orders would no longer be able to be ignored. Many of the new cities that were being created as a result of collectivisation contained huge numbers of peasants who had fled the countryside because of collectivisation. So the Great Terror would keep these peasants arriving in the cities. It would keep them under control. Stalin was also conscious of the international context. He knew that Hitler had just come to power in Germany. He knew that Hitler was hostile towards communism and had been predicting that war between Germany and the Soviet Union was inevitable. So he needed to push on even further as far as industrialisation and as far as the 5-year plans were concerned. And on top of this, he needed an army which was completely loyal to him. So he wanted total control, and one way of getting total control is to place everyone in a feeling of fear. So the third reason, we've touched upon this, and there are real overlaps between these points, is Stalin's own personality. So the purges were partly driven by Stalin's paranoid personality. He saw plots everywhere. He continues to see threats everywhere. You know, at the end of his life, when he dies in 1953, he is at that point still planning another great purge. So Stalin enjoyed grudges, violence came easy to him, and he enjoyed taking revenge. So anybody who had opposed him was in trouble. All of these character traits came out in particular after his wife committed suicide in 1932. It was over an argument about the Great Famine. He felt betrayed by his wife's suicide. He grew even more isolated. He only mixed more with his inner circle, and all of those negative character traits really came to the fore following the death of his wife. So his paranoid personality is the third reason. The fourth reason is terror economics. So many of those who were caught up in the terror weren't executed, they were sent to the gulags. The gulags are basically slave labour camps. So the gulags provide slave labour, provide cheap labour. You don't have to worry about paying them. You don't have to work about conditions for those who were in the gulags. So they were able to carry out the most dangerous tasks as far as the 5-year plans were concerned. So, for example, the construction of the White Sea Canal, the most dangerous tasks on things like the construction of the Moscow Metro were carried out by slave labour. So it's estimated that by the end of the 1930s, there were almost 8 million Gulag prisoners. That is a slave labour force of 8 million people, which Stalin was able to use to help modernise and industrialise the country. What the Purges also did was they created scapegoats. They created people who you could blame, saboteurs, wreckers, enemies of the people, people who were held responsible other than Stalin and the regime if targets were being missed and if the standard of living wasn't what people hoped it would be. So it created this sense of paranoia. Workers were able to and encouraged to report on factory managers and other workers if they suspected them of being saboteurs. So terror economics is the third reason. And finally, we can ignore Stalin. We can say that Lenin was partly responsible. Stalin was not the first Soviet leader to use purges, to use terror. Lenin had used it. Lenin had established the Cheka when the party came to power. The first purges which took place in Russia were the purges of the Russian Orthodox Church, which had been carried out by Lenin and the Cheka, which evolved into the NKVD under Stalin. So Lenin had set other precedents. He'd come to power through a revolution. He'd dissolved the Constituent Assembly, a democratic institution. The Red Terror had been introduced during the Civil War. You know, you had revolutionary justice where the emphasis was on making sure all threats were eliminated, and if that meant that a few innocent people were found guilty, so be it. So defenders of Lenin have said that he did do these things, but not on the same scale as Stalin, whereas critics of Lenin have argued that what Stalin did was, you know, in excess of what Lenin did when we're looking at the number of people who were killed, but the precedent was set by Lenin, and that allowed Stalin to get away with what he did.